Pirates of the Caribbean on shrooms, the most interesting evil empire I've ever seen depicted. I wonder if trilogies are suffocating the fantasy genre. The Masquerade series by Seth Dickinson has been an incredible journey these past couple weeks. I just finished reading Tyrant Baru Cormorant earlier this week on Wednesday, and then I spent all of Thursday just trawling the internet for every scrap of spoilery discussion I could find. There are so many theories and interesting things happening in that book that I'm just so excited for book 4. I have a lot of thoughts about the structure of the series and a lot of critiques that I think could have been implemented to make this overall a much stronger experience for the reader. A lot of people read book 1 way back when, and not a lot of people have continued on with the series. Based on Goodreads ratings, there's a pretty steep drop-off from book 1 to book 2, going from 20,000 down to 7,000, and then even less for book 3. I think book 3 only has around 4,000 reviews on Goodreads, and obviously that's not like the end-all be-all metric of how popular a book series is, but I think it is indicative of how people haven't really continued on with the series, and myself included. It took me 2 years to circle back to read book 2 and 3. Yeah, the series is so huge and complicated and complex, and it often feels like more of a thought experiment in a very interesting way than anything else. I've been having a lot of trouble filming this video, trying to come up with ways to convey how I feel about the series without spoilers. What I'm going to do in this video is talk about some of the questions that Seth Dickinson is trying to ask through these books, talk about the high-level themes instead of like going through the characters and the plot, and more focusing on the meat of the books and the underlying subtext of the things that Dickinson is trying to talk about. If you haven't read book 1, I will give a very quick summary. Basically, it's about this girl, Baru Cormorant. She's very young when the series starts. She is a savant. She is amazing at mathematics, and she lives on the island of Terranoke. Her island is conquered by the Falcresti Empire. They bring roads and schools and inoculations, which are basically vaccines, and they have this very advanced knowledge of medicine and science, and they bring all of this to the island, but they also, with that, bring deep oppression. They are entirely transformed by the colonization of this island. They have to let go of their cultural practices and conform to the Falcresti idea of what is hygienic. Hygiene and order and cleanliness are a huge part of Falcresti culture that just completely transforms Baru's homeland. But Baru herself is also enveloped into the empire as she starts to attend the school, and very quickly her intelligence carries her to stations in the empire that are incredibly powerful. Baru is constantly being tested through this process, and her loyalties are being questioned, whether or not she's truly loyal to the empire because of her heritage and where she comes from. And yeah, it's just an incredible setup for a series, and I think that Dickinson has achieved one of the most interesting and minute, granular looks at what imperialism looks like, what the project of imperialism does to a culture, but also just on the individual level, how the psychology of Baru develops and is impacted by this honestly terrible thing that has happened to her homeland. Being colonized is a terrible thing, and I will say that Dickinson deals with this with a lot of nuance. It's not like he's coming in and sort of portraying this noble other or noble savage kind of trope. There is so much discussion of how cultures, without colonization aren't perfect. There are a lot of evils being done in cultures that are uncolonized, and sometimes when the Falcresti come in and, civilize a culture, they are bringing advancements because of their advanced medical knowledge, their advanced scientific knowledge, in some ways improving things for the people that they conquer. The series really investigates that in such an interesting way, where Dickinson asks how science can be subverted to do so much evil under the hands of an empire, and how science and medicine and technology start to become tools for the empire to justify their own supremacy. We see this happen in the real world so often, and I think the thing that I love about the series more than anything is how Dickinson makes me curious about the real world. I see these things playing out in the books, and it makes me want to learn more about my own history. I'm Indian and the British colonized India, but it makes me curious and makes me want to learn more about how imperialism has played out in the real world. Something that Dickinson does in Monster Brew Cormorant, book 2, in the acknowledgements, is he talks about some of the real world inspirations for things that happen in that book, and I found that so fascinating. In general, to talk about the series in terms of its place in the genre, it's, nebulous what it actually is, I would say. Like, book 1 definitely is very light on any actual sort of like magical or supernatural elements. Books 2 and 3 really up the ante in that regard, and you really start to see why it's shelved in the fantasy section. I love the inclusion of magic in books 2 and 3, and to be very vague, this concept of science comes up. I think he asks the question of, what is the difference between magic and science? And there are so many things that happen where I'm like, is this a real thing that happens in the real world? It feels very grounded in neurology, in psychology, and I love that melding of things. As cerebral as the series is, there are some deeply fantastic action sequences that feel like they are Pirates of the Caribbean on shrooms. Book 3 especially has one of my favorite nautical battle scenes of all time. The ships that are involved are insane, and I say this having read the Live Ship Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb. Having said that, if you're looking for a series that is very action-packed, you should steer away from this. It is very much, like I said, interested in answering these questions about society and individual psychology. Like, it's not a series that is super battle heavy, but there are some really great action sequences. There's another really interesting thing that happens in books 2 and 3, ties in with the nautical aspects of these books. The Navy in this world is primarily made up of women. I think that Dickinson's exploration of how women operate under an imperial power and how women are tools of the oppressor, and how women through the Navy, are instrumental parts of how the Falcrest conquers other people, and yet how women themselves in the Navy are oppressed under Falcrest's regime. I found that really fascinating, and it's just so complicated and nuanced the way that Dickinson depicts this empire. Evil empires are a fantasy trope. It's something that has been run into the ground at this point, but I think that Falcrest is truly the most interesting evil empire I've ever seen depicted in fantasy, and it's because of its groundedness in history and reality, and how Dickinson explores the psychology of empire and how it really conquers not just land and resources, but people's ideologies become weaponized. That is what makes this series so different and so good. I don't know if I mentioned earlier in the introduction about some of my critiques of the series structure. I think Monster Brew Cormorant ends up being as interesting as the questions it's asking are. In practice, and the sort of like reader experience of reading Monster Brew Cormorant was a little all over the place because it is so packed with so many things happening. It is incredibly fast-paced, and I think that Monster Brew Cormorant felt like, to me, the skeleton of a draft of a book. I wouldn't change a single thing that actually happens on the page. I would just break it up into 2 books. Like, I think there was enough lore, world building, character stuff, action sequences, just in general. Like, there were so many things happening in this book that it could have been expanded into 2 volumes, and it would have allowed all of those individual things to breathe a little bit more and to really hit home for me personally if it had been 2 books. I think that the fact that this series was originally billed as a trilogy, and the fact that book 3 got extended into 4 books, is just sort of like indicative to me that it deserved to have more books to begin with. And I think Monster really suffers from the fact that it was the second book in a trilogy and it was trying to do so much. Like, this series could have been 10 books like Malazan. It has the same level of complexity and character work and writing style I think that Dickinson has. I think it could have been 10 books. Like, he has that in him, and I really wish that he had been afforded that opportunity instead of having to cram it all into a trilogy. That being said, even though I had problems with Monster, reading Tyrant Baru Cormorant really solved a lot of those problems, and I think Tyrant was a much better book. Book 3 and Book 2 feel like one huge volume in that regard. They do feel like one solid story, whereas Book 1 is like much more self-contained. I see this a lot in general in fantasy as well. Like, I'm thinking of Evan Winter's Fires of Vengeance, or what's it, Rage of Dragons series, where he's having a lot of trouble wrapping it up in Book 3. And like, I wonder if trilogies are suffocating the fantasy genre. Is 3 books enough for an epic fantasy series with all the world building and characters and multiple POVs that we love? Like, is 3 books enough for that? And should we be gunning for more books? I don't know. I don't know anything about publishing. I've never written a book. I'm not an author. But as a reader, I really wonder that. I just finished actually reading The Dagger and the Coin series by Daniel Abraham, which deals with a lot of the same concepts that Dickinson deals with, but in a much more like straightforward epic fantasy setting. But that was 5 books. And I think that having the 5 books really allowed Abraham to explore the world at a pace that felt right. Abraham's pacing is still very fast. Like, he does a lot of time skips, he does a lot of time jumps, but it's very consistent. Having the 5 books, I think, allowed him to go on these detours with the plot, and it didn't feel like he was just constantly, unrelentingly throwing stuff at the reader. Yeah, I really wish that this series, the Masquerade series by Seth Dickinson, had been allowed 5 books at the very least. I think I could see a version of it where it was 10 books, but if it had 5 books, I think it would have been even better. Despite my problems with Monster's structure and pacing, I loved the series, and I know a lot of people would maybe not agree with me. I think it's not for everyone, certainly. Seth Dickinson's writing style is very much this very disjointed, sort of sharp cutting writing style that jumps around a lot and is very just intense at times, and I love that, but I think I could see someone not really jiving with it at all, and not really jiving with the thought experiment aspect of the books. Again, if it had been 10 books and Dickinson had been allowed to walk us through his thought experiments with these characters instead of having to sometimes tell the thought experiment, it would have been so much more interesting. I will say it's been 5 years since book 4 came out. Dickinson has written a couple blog posts saying that he's working on it, and he's written other books in the meantime. So I think that book 4 will come out eventually. Confident this is not a Rothfuss situation, because Dickinson has been actually like active and is writing other things. So we'll get book 4 eventually, hopefully. Please, I hope. Hopefully having that idea of the high level sort of questions and themes and concepts that Dickinson is going for here helps you suss out whether or not it would be for you. Read a couple chapters of Trader Brew Cormorant and see if the writing style jives with your reading style. If you like the writing style and you are curious about the things that I talk about here in terms of theme, give it a go. One last thing before I go is that you should definitely look up trigger warnings for this series if that is something that you're concerned about, because there are a lot of pretty horrible things that happen. I mean, it's a book about imperialism, and imperialism has wrought and done terrible things to people. Please look that up before diving into this. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments down below if there are any things that I could sort of go more deeper into. I would be happy to answer any questions that come up. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, take care.